Have you ever felt strangely apathetic even when everything seems to be fine? Have you noticed a silent sadness emerging for no clear reason, a sense of emptiness that seems to grow with the passing days? Many interpret this state as emotional weakness, inexplicable depression, or even a supposed ingratitude for not being able to feel happy even with a functional life. But what if the cause isn't within you? What if it's the world around you that is making you sick? On the surface, modern society is a triumph of efficiency. Entire cities have been built to optimize time, increase productivity, and connect millions of people. But in this process of building the modern world, something essential has been left behind: beauty. Not beauty as aesthetic luxury, but as a deep psychological necessity. Alain de Botton, a contemporary philosopher, argues that we are experiencing a kind of chronic aesthetic hunger. According to him, our environments have not only ceased to be beautiful, they have become actively hostile to human sensitivity. Imagine spending all your days surrounded by grey walls, cold corridors, constant artificial light, and repeated geometric shapes that communicate nothing. Imagine living in neighborhoods where no visual element refers to nature, history, art, or symbol. This everyday ugliness is not neutral. It communicates, it oppresses, it dehumanizes, and most alarmingly, it makes us sick. According to Botton, architecture has the power to shape the human mind. When we spend too much time in environments devoid of beauty, our brains respond with mental states equally devoid of vitality. Ugly environments create ugly mental states. This is not about being fussy or overly sensitive. It is a perfectly natural reaction to a world that has stopped considering the human soul in the design of its spaces. And what makes this thesis even more unsettling is that a large part of people do not even realize they are being affected, because ugliness has become the norm. We have been told that caring about aesthetics is frivolity, that design is vanity, that beauty is something superfluous. But the truth is quite the opposite. Beauty, when absent, reveals what is most essential in the human psyche. Its absence hurts, and this wound is manifesting in silent epidemics of anxiety, depression, apathy, and emotional disconnection. In this video, we will explore how the modern environment, from cities to homes, from offices to public spaces, is slowly destroying the human mind. Not through explicit violence, but through monotony, the absence of symbolism, the deliberate elimination of everything that makes a space truly human. And more importantly, we will investigate how it is possible to resist, how it is possible to reconnect with beauty deliberately, and use this reconnection as an antidote against the psychological collapse imposed by a functional yet aesthetically sterile world. This is not just a video about architecture. It is a video about emotional survival in a world that has lost its visual soul. Because perhaps what is depressing you is not your mind. Perhaps it is the place where your mind is forced to live. For millions of years, the human brain developed amidst nature. Trees, flowing water, subtle variations of sunlight, organic textures, the sound of the wind, the smell of wet earth. This was the standard backdrop for which our minds were shaped. The natural environment not only provided shelter, it also stimulated, calmed, guided, and nurtured our emotional balance. But today, most people spend their days surrounded by concrete, glass, noise, and constant artificial light. The result: a silent yet devastating sensory deprivation. Our nervous system relies on certain stimuli to function healthily. Natural light, for example, regulates our circadian rhythm, a vital biological cycle that influences sleep, mood, and even disposition. But in closed environments, lit by fluorescent bulbs and lacking visual contact with the sky or vegetation, disrupt this cycle. The body may continue to function, but the mind begins to collapse. Philosopher Alain de Botton argues that by eliminating beauty from our environments, we are attacking a fundamental psychological need. In The Architecture of Happiness, he writes that we are, for better or worse, different people in different places. In other words, physical space alters our emotional identity. It is not an exaggeration to say that living in ugly, lifeless places gradually makes us more tired, more insensitive, and more empty. This happens because the deprivation of beauty creates a constant state of alertness. The brain, when exposed to monotonous and sterile environments, interprets the absence of positive stimuli as a sign of threat. This results in a background anxiety, an internal tension that is rarely consciously perceived but accumulates over days, weeks, and years. It's like living trapped in an environment that subtly communicates all the time. You don't belong here. You are not important. Beauty, contrary to what many think, is not an adornment. It is a regulating element. Seeing a sunset, a tree swaying in the wind, or a meaningful piece of art triggers real biochemical reactions: dopamine release, cortisol reduction, activation of brain areas linked to pleasure, empathy, and contemplation. The continuous absence of these stimuli impoverishes our inner life, and over time makes us feel like broken machines within a system that demands productivity but denies vitality. This aesthetic deprivation also robs us of the ability to imagine. Ugly, repetitive, and symbolically lifeless environments keep us trapped in an operational mental state, where everything is urgent, functional, and immediate. We lose the internal space necessary to reflect, dream, and create. After all, how can we cultivate elevated thoughts in places that evoke absolutely nothing? How can we find meaning in a visually empty life? And most alarmingly, the more time you spend in such environments, the more you get used to it. Ugliness becomes the norm. Apathy becomes routine. And eventually, you stop realizing that you are merely surviving in a space that consumes you. Not because you are weak, but because your environment was never designed to support you as a human being. In the next part, we will dive even deeper into this architectural collapse, exploring how modern spaces have been deliberately designed to serve maximum productivity, and why this design, focused solely on profit and efficiency, is silently transforming us into emotionally stunted beings. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. The aesthetics of modern environments did not arise by accident. They were designed with a very clear objective: to maximize efficiency. Offices, corporate buildings, schools, and even hospitals were conceived as production systems, and not as human spaces. Straight lines, neutral tones, constant white light, functional furniture, absence of personality. Everything was designed for a single purpose: to keep bodies active and minds focused on operational tasks. But by removing everything that could distract the individual, they also removed what nourished them from within. This logic, inherited from the Industrial Revolution and perpetuated by modern corporations, treats human beings as resources. And like any resource, their utility is measured only by their productivity. The environment, in this context, ceases to be a space for emotional expression or symbolic contemplation, and becomes an extension of the production line. Identical cubicles, grey walls, oppressive silence interrupted only by the sound of keys and notifications. This is the habitat of millions of people around the world, a habitat designed not to inspire, but to control. The problem is that the human mind does not operate well under this type of sensory oppression. When continuously exposed to sterile environments, it enters a containment mode. Thoughts become utilitarian, emotions are repressed, creativity diminishes, and over time, the individual begins to disconnect not only from the space, but from themselves. Productivity may even increase for a few days, weeks, but slowly the soul begins to fade. Alain de Botton observes that one of the great mistakes of modern architecture was abandoning the idea that the environment should reflect who we are and who we want to be. Instead, it came to reflect only goals of efficiency and control. As he writes, the belief in the importance of architecture stems from the notion that we are, for better or worse, different people in different places. In other words, by inhabiting spaces created solely to transform humans into productive cogs, we inevitably become cogs, worn out, alienated, and easily replaceable. The so-called aesthetics of maximum productivity also imposes a uniformity that nullifies the sense of individual identity. Corporate environments do not allow personal expression. Photos on the desk are seen as distractions. Bright colors are considered childish or inappropriate. Works of art, cultural elements, religious or spiritual symbols are avoided to maintain a neutral environment. But what presents itself as neutrality is, in fact, a deliberate erasure of human subjectivity. It is the architecture of obedience. Furthermore, this aesthetic creates an illusion of order that masks internal chaos. On the outside, everything appears clean, organized, standardized, but inside, workers face silent crises of anxiety, depression, burnout, and depersonalization. People who spend years in sterile environments report feeling that their lives have become colorless, soulless, meaningless. It is no coincidence. The physical space is literally shaping the collective emotional state, and no one is talking about it. This productivity aesthetic has also infiltrated our homes. Excessive minimalism, palettes of gray, white, and beige, generic mass-produced furniture, influenced by design trends that promise visual cleanliness and functionality, many people are transforming their homes into extensions of the corporate environment, cold, impersonal, and silently oppressive. But a home should be a sanctuary, not a workplace. This disconnection between environment and emotion is not just uncomfortable, it is pathological. When we live in spaces that do not reflect our feelings, our stories, or our aspirations, we begin to believe that these elements do not matter. The human psyche starts to adjust to the void, as if it were normal to live in a world without color, without poetry, and without meaning. But there is something even more dangerous than impersonal functionality. And that is the theme of the next part, digital sensory overload. Because if, on one hand, our physical spaces have been emptied of symbolic stimulus, on the other hand, our minds are being bombarded, day and night, by an excess of digital stimuli that keep us in a permanent state of alert. And this contrast between the sterile physical environment and the chaotic excess of the virtual is creating an unsustainable tension within the modern mind. If physical environments have been reduced to neutral and silent boxes, the digital universe has taken the opposite path. It has become a space of extreme, constant, and fragmented stimulation. This combination is toxic. During the day, the individual moves through dead visual spaces, cold offices, colorless corridors, soulless buildings. And in the few moments when they are not producing, they plunge into a sea of frantic digital stimuli that capture, kidnap, and exhaust their attention. We live in an era of digital overstimulation. Notifications, banners, short videos, instant messages, endless feeds. Every second of your attention is being contested by algorithms that have been refined precisely to generate compulsion. And the brain, unable to process this torrent of data in balance, enters a state of permanent alert, a kind of chronic, invisible but devastating stress. This sensory overload does not provide the type of stimulation that nourishes the mind, as a natural landscape or a carefully observed work of art would. On the contrary, it fragments the cognitive experience. You no longer contemplate. you consume, and consume in pieces. Jumping from stimulus to stimulus, with no time to process, integrate, or reflect. The result is a collapse of attention, an increasing inability to delve into anything, and an increasingly superficial, anxious, and restless mind. Alain de Botton, in The Architecture of Happiness, suggests that physical spaces have the power to calm us, to reconnect us with deeper parts of ourselves. They function as mirrors of our internal state, but also as guides, helping us remember who we are when the world fragments us. The problem is that today, most of our conscious time is not spent in these reconnection spaces, but within screens that only reinforce our dissociation. And there is another aggravating factor. Digital stimulation is cheap and immediate. The pleasure of seeing a real landscape requires presence, time, silence. Meanwhile, the pleasure of the feed is instant, easy, and infinite. Gradually, the brain begins to prefer this type of quick reward. But this comes at a cost, the destruction of the capacity for contemplation, which is an essential function of mental health. Contemplation is what allows us to feel beauty. And without beauty, there is no meaning. This creates a cruel paradox. We live in physically numbing and digitally hyper-stimulating environments. The real world makes us ill through absence. The virtual world makes us ill through excess. And, caught between these two extremes, we lose the ability to perceive what is killing us. The human soul finds itself without space, without pause, without refuge. And when even the buildings we live or work in begin to mimic digital logic, with impersonal lines, reflective surfaces, total absence of symbols or meaning, the process of dehumanization is complete. Because what is happening to you is not a simple case of fatigue or lack of focus. It is a psychological collapse induced by environments that were not made to sustain the complexity of being human. But there is an even deeper component to this equation, something that explains why, even in silence, even without digital stimulation, certain environments still make us feel empty, insignificant, or depressed. It is about dehumanized architecture, spaces that, in their very structure and form, communicate that you are just another piece of a system, a number, a data point, a cog. And that is exactly what we will talk about in the next part: how modern architecture, by prioritizing the functional and eliminating the symbolic, has created buildings that resemble emotional prisons more than spaces for human coexistence. Architecture should be an extension of the human soul, a physical form to express values, emotions, history, and collective identity. However, what we see today in the major cities around the world is the complete opposite. Buildings that impose themselves like hostile fortresses, housing complexes that repeat like poorly made copies of a generic model, streets without trees, without benches, without spaces to pause, identical shops with cold displays, subway stations that resemble nuclear shelters. And the most disturbing part, all of this was done by choice. It was not an accident, it was design. The so-called dehumanized architecture is a direct product of modern logic that prioritizes function, cost, and efficiency over any symbolic or emotional consideration. Alain de Botton, in The Architecture of Happiness, shows how we build cities that reflect only our technical capacity, but not our existential depth. When architecture stops telling stories, it stops reminding us of who we are. And when the space around us becomes indifferent to our presence, we begin to feel invisible. This architectural indifference has profound psychic effects. Imagine living in a building that looks like a concrete box, without balconies, without details, without color. A place where each floor is the same as the previous one, each apartment a repetition of the other, each window a frame for an equally gray world. What does this space communicate day after day to those who inhabit it? It communicates that you do not matter, that your individuality is irrelevant, that you are just another body to be stored. Such environments are not only ugly, they are oppressive. They scream silence. They scream impersonality. And the human being, surrounded by these spaces, internalizes the message. They begin to believe that their presence is insignificant, that they have nothing unique to offer, that their suffering is irrelevant. After all, even the building they live in seems indifferent to their existence. In corporations, the logic repeats itself. Offices designed like cages of glass and steel, meeting rooms without windows, long and soulless corridors. The environments are cold, linear, and predictable. Everything has been designed to reduce distractions, increase control, and standardize behaviors. The result is an architecture that does not inspire. It only surveils. It does not welcome. It only delineates. It does not engage with the psyche. It only shapes it in silence. And it does not stop there. Dehumanized architecture also disintegrates the sense of belonging. When all buildings look the same, when there are no cultural traits, no history, no craftsmanship, no symbols, then the space loses the power to connect us with something greater. We lose our sense of place. And without it, we also lose part of our identity. We begin to float through environments that do not evoke memories, do not awaken affection, and do not offer meaning. Alain de Botton argues that architecture has a vital psychological role to visually remind us of who we could be at our best. But when the space becomes indifferent, without history, without form, without soul, it prevents us from aspiring to anything beyond survival. And this gradually destroys us from within. However, perhaps the most serious aspect of modern architecture is the total absence of symbolic meaning. Because it is not just beauty that has disappeared from cities, it was also the silent language of spaces, the one that, for centuries, communicated values, beliefs, and worldviews. And it is precisely about this that we will talk in the next part. How the loss of symbolism in environments is contributing to a collective existential void, and why architecture, when devoid of narrative, ceases to be space and becomes merely containment. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. Architecture, since the dawn of civilization, has always carried hidden meanings. Every detail, every shape, every ornament was a symbolic gesture, a way to communicate ideas that went beyond functionality. Temples, palaces, squares, houses, and churches were not just constructions. They were narratives carved in stone. They reminded us of where we came from, who we are, and what we value as a society. Architecture was language, and this language spoke directly to the human psyche. But in the contemporary world, this symbolic dimension has been completely erased. What were once soulful buildings have become utilitarian structures devoid of any deep humanity. Aesthetics have been reduced to function. Language has been replaced by silence. Ornamentation, once sacred, is now seen as waste. And with that, we have lost something essential, the sense that the space around us has something to tell us. According to Alain de Botton, modern architecture is often morally mute. It does not communicate values, does not inspire conduct, does not stimulate reflection. It merely exists. He writes that buildings may even possess moral messages, but they lack the power to impose them. They suggest, but do not command. They invite, but do not demand. The absence of this symbolic suggestion creates an invisible void, a space that does not provoke us, does not challenge us, and does not elevate us. It merely accommodates us in its inexpressiveness. The architecture of the past was rich in symbolism. A Gothic pointed arch suggested transcendence. A Byzantine mosaic whispered eternity. A wooden carving told the story of a people. Even the layout of a Roman square or the curvature of a Baroque staircase had hidden meanings. But today, we enter a public building, an apartment, or even a school, and there is nothing to indicate what that space represents. There is no narrative, there is no message, there is no soul, and this has profound consequences for our experience of existence. Because human beings need context. They need symbols to organize the chaos of inner life. They need spaces that connect them to something greater than themselves, be it transcendence, ancestry, memory, or beauty. Environments without symbolic meaning become sterile not only visually, but emotionally. And life within them begins to resemble a mechanical cycle of repetition and emptiness. This symbolic emptiness also reinforces the crisis of collective identity. When public spaces do not reflect the culture, history, or values of a people, individuals cease to feel part of something. They begin to exist as isolated individuals within generic landscapes. And this feeling of alienation is, ultimately, one of the pillars of modern suffering. Architecture, by ceasing to represent something, comes to represent nothing. And in this nothing, our minds sink. Furthermore, without symbols that inspire meaning, any attempt at introspection or transcendence becomes more difficult. It is much more challenging to reflect on the meaning of life in a white room with smooth walls than in front of a stained glass window illuminated by the sun, or beneath a hand-carved ceiling. The environment, when well constructed, serves as a starting point for deep thought. When poorly constructed, it traps us on the surface of existence. Therefore, it is not just about aesthetic preferences. It is about the survival of something essentially human, our ability to attribute meaning to the world, and when this is removed, what remains is merely function. Efficiency without soul, presence without belonging, production without purpose. But not all is lost. It is still possible to resist. It is still possible to reclaim beauty, meaning, and humanity in the spaces we inhabit. And this begins with small, yet conscious actions. In the next part, we will explore practical and profound ways to recreate environments that nurture the mind, even within a society that insists on erasing beauty. Because even surrounded by functional ugliness, it is still possible to claim the right to aesthetics as a form of healing and reconnection. In the face of this devastating scenario, where environments silently make us ill, where architecture has lost its soul and aesthetics have been treated as a frivolous luxury, one inevitable question remains: what can we do? How can we psychologically survive in a world that no longer offers us emotional shelter? The answer, though subtle, is powerful. We must deliberately reclaim the right to beauty, not as decoration, not as vanity, but as an act of resistance. Because contrary to what the system has taught us, caring for the environment we live in is not a whim. It is psychological survival. Every detail matters. Every visual element that surrounds us has the power to affect our mood, our thoughts, and even our behavior. When you introduce beauty into your life, when you consciously choose what to see, what to touch, what to feel around you, you are telling the world, my mind matters, my well-being matters. I am not just a production machine. Beauty can be reintroduced in simple yet meaningful ways. Live plants in the workspace, natural light whenever possible, colors that evoke positive emotions, textures that remind us of nature, pictures, objects with history, symbols that connect you to your journey or spirituality. The size of the space doesn't matter. What matters is the intention, the gesture, the silent affirmation that the environment should serve the psyche, and not just productivity. Botton reminds us that a house is not just a place to live. It is a place that helps us remember who we are. But if the space we inhabit is impersonal, ugly, sterile, and generic, what kind of memory is it offering us? Probably none. That's why it's essential that we start to build, even on a micro scale, mental refugees within the grey jungle we have been placed in. Micro sanctuaries, corners of beauty, environments where we can breathe, silence, reflect, remember. And if we cannot transform the whole, we can still claim parts. A corner of the house, a hallway with pictures that resonate with your soul, a shelf with books that awaken memories, a vase of flowers in the bathroom, a chair positioned where the morning sun shines. Small gestures that become great armors against the collective void. But perhaps the most important thing is to understand that feeling affected by ugly environments is not a weakness. It is a sign of sanity. When a building oppresses you, when an office depresses you, when an entire neighborhood conveys coldness and abandonment, you are not being too sensitive. You are having a perfectly human response to a dehumanized environment. And recognizing this is already the first step toward healing. Therefore, reclaiming beauty is a radical act. It is a silent challenge to the system. It is a non-verbal scream that says, I am more than function, I am more than efficiency. I am a human being, and I need aesthetics to continue being. Caring for the environment around you is caring for your mind. And in this brutally functional world, where everything is grey, practical and repetitive, this care becomes a form of intimate revolution. So now that you've seen how the environment silently impacts your mind, tell me, what is the ugliest place you have ever lived or worked, and how did it affect you? Leave it in the comments. And if this video spoke to you, share it. Take this conversation to others who may also be suffering without knowing why. And remember, the next video is a continuation of this journey. If you want to understand even more deeply the invisible mechanisms that shape your inner life, don't stop here. The next episode is essential. See you there.